Welcome to the podcast on North American literature hosted by the Research Group Studies in American Literature and Culture from the University of Granada. I am Rita Pérez Gallego, and today I will be hosting this podcast and will be interviewing Laura Domenech Lopez. Today's topic will be the psychological depiction of the two female lead characters in two different novels, The Coquette by Hannah Webster Foster and The Age of Innocence by Edith Wharton. Without further ado, let me greet our guest. Hello, Laura. How are you?
Hello, Rita. Thanks for having me today. I'm pretty good. How about you?
I'm great. Thanks for participating in our podcast. So, first of all, could you explain briefly the plot of both novels for the people in the audience that may have not read them?
Of course. The Coquette, also known as The History of Eliza Wharton by Hannah Webster Foster, narrates the story of Eliza Wharton, a woman whose fiancé has just recently died, and she decides to stay single and not to marry. Because of the social convention of the period, deciding not to marry implied that she was mourning her fiancé and that she was not interested in any other man. However, along the story can be seen that Eliza does not really care about her ex-fiancé and seeks the attention of men, being characterized as the typical fairy woman. That attitude ends up leading her to a tragical ending, her death. On the other hand, The Age of Innocence by Edith Wharton is set in the high-class society of New York and narrates the story of Newland Archer, a lawyer who courts and marries May Welland, but discovers that he is in love with the Countess Ellen Olenska. Ellen is the cousin of May, but she moved out of New York to Europe in order to marry Count Olensky. However, it was not a happy marriage, and she goes back to New York seeking her family's support to get a divorce. But eventually, she is forced back into her unhappy marriage with the Count. During her visit in New York, Ellen and Newland realize that they love each other, but their current relationships with the Count and May, respectively, stopped them from being together.
Really interesting. What can you tell me about both settings or context of the novels?
So, The Coquette is set in the late 18th century and reflects the society of said period. The novel presents an accurate portrait of the societal conventions and expectations, especially towards women. It is important to keep in mind that the historical context plays an essential role in the novel, as it is the extra-linguistic reality what appears in the novel. The Coquette was, in fact, based on a true event that happened a decade earlier, the story of Elizabeth Whitman, a woman from Connecticut who, after rejecting many suitors, was seduced by a man who left her when he discovered that she was pregnant with his child. She ran away to have the baby and died from complications of the childbirth. This story inspired Hannah Webster Foster and also helped her to write her book, as the American public still was a bit skeptical about fictional series and preferred books based on real facts. On the other hand, The Age of Innocence is set in the late 19th century, even though it was published in the early 20th century. It also reflects the societal convention and expectation were still very present in the life of the people from the high classes in New York. The intended effect was to reflect how obsolete these were, and as modern times were approaching, how ridiculous it was to still follow them. Edith Wharton used her own life experience in such elite New York society in order to make a more realistic analysis and portrait in her work.
Okay, and what about both authors? Could you give me some details about them, some biographical information of both Hannah Webster Foster and Edith Wharton?
Yes, Hannah Webster Foster was born in a town from Massachusetts in 1758, and her father was a wealthy merchant, which allowed her to have access to a good education, probably in one of the early female academies that proliferated in this period. She moved to Boston and began reading essays for newspaper and periodicals. Then, in 1785, she married John Foster, a Congregational clergyman. They settled in the south of Boston and they raised 6 children. When her husband died, Hannah moved to Montreal, in Canada. She wrote 2 novels, The Coquette, which was published in 1797, and The Boarding School, published in 1798. However, the latter did not get the recognition that the first obtained, and it lacks the narrative drive and psychological complexity of her more famous and much reprinted work, The Coquette. Then, Edith Newell Jones was born in New York City in 1872 into a rather rigid family. She was educated by tutors and governesses, much of the time while the family resided in Europe. In 1885, she married the Bostonian Edward Wharton. However, their marriage was not happy, and in 1913, she was able to get a divorce due to Edward's adultery. Wharton's education, through tutors and travel, never satisfies her quest for knowledge, and she tried to compensate for this by extensive reading in her father's library and the libraries of her friends' fathers. Women during that period were taught how to be good wives and devoted to their husbands, but Wharton, rejecting this ideology and this mentality, began to write as a teenager. However, it was not until the late 1890s, more or less, when Wharton fully embraced authorship as a career. She produced more than 80 short stories and 22 novellas and novels, including The Age of Innocence, which was published in 1920.
Okay, so about the research, what can you tell us about the psychological depiction of Eliza Wharton in The Coquette?
So, Eliza Wharton is the main character of The Coquette, and the majority of the novel is presented via her own perspective through her personal letters, which lets the reader to have a direct access into her thoughts and feelings. This offers an open window to her psychological complexity and morality. She is presented as the typical figure of the coquette, someone who enjoys flirting with different men just after her fiancé died and without committing to any of them. However, simplifying the behavior of Elisa only to the romantic aspects may leave a sensation of emptiness, as the reasons of Elisa's actions have a deeper cause. Elisa is just a victim of the social pressure that women had at the time, and that directly leads to her mentality, her actions, and how she ended. Eliza Wharton was never taught anything besides of marriage and how to be the perfect wife, leading to a huge ill preparedness for life and the inability to fight for herself. What she really sought was independence and happiness, which was almost frustrated with an arranged marriage with Mr. Halley, but he died, and she could not hide her joy about that. This is the moment where her true enjoyment starts, and she initiates a life that she was not able to have if she would have been married. However, once she started developing her social life and attending public events back again, she was again exposed to say social expectations, and she is once again seeking happiness in men, but only because that is all she knew and all she was taught. It can be perfectly seen how her behavior and the decisions she makes are a consequence of a much bigger problem: the pressure from social expectations that women had to deal with daily and that reduced them to the mere marriage market.
And what about your research about the psychological depiction of Ellen Olenska in The Age of Innocence?
So, Ellen Olenska is the main female character of The Age of Innocence and also presents a very complex psychology even deeper than the protagonist of The Coquette. Ellen is a mature woman who is determined to take control of her own life and make decisions for herself. In addition, in The Age of Innocence, the narrator is omniscient, allowing to see this moral complexity more objectively and from the perspective of the rest of the characters too. Ellen Olenska is seen like an outsider because after living for a long time in Europe, when she comes back to New York, she realizes how society, as well as its expectations and rules, have not changed a bit since she left. Her European experience made her feel like she had already left behind this obsolete New Yorker's lifestyle and she did not know how to get used to it back again. It is exactly this time that she has spent in Europe and her unhappy marriage what formed her desire to be independent. But coming back to New York, she fell once again under the oppressing social expectation that women had, and Ellen Olenska demonstrates that she's a very intelligent woman who appreciated art and cultural events. Newland Arkers, who is the main character of the novel, his thoughts and reflection over the issue of the divorce of Ellen and her situation are very important for the construction of this psychological complexity that Ellen presents. Also, it has to be mentioned that Edith Wharton herself portrays her own life experience in the character of Ellen Olenska, as they share aspects like being born into the strict society of New York, going through an unhappy marriage, moving to Europe, and their artistic sensibilities. This self characterization allows the author to provide a better psychological portrait of the character as it is directly connected to her own experience and thoughts, creating the moral complexity that Ellen Olenska presents.
So, could it be said that there was some influence of the coquette by Hannah Webster Foster in the work of Edith Wharton, The Age of Innocence?
Actually, yes, the psychological portraits of both characters are a clear demonstration of how both novels share many aspects, due to the fact that Edith Wharton had The Coquette by Hannah Webster Foster as a model when she wrote The Age of Innocence. Both authors are separated by a whole century, which explains how Edith Wharton adapts her novel to the modernism that characterized her time, using a more complex character depiction. Elisa Wharton was an inspiration for the creation of Ellen Olenska, as they both portray the limitation that they had, the social expectation that women were oppressed with, the consequence that trying to avoid said expectation had, and how marriage was more of a sacrifice than a love affair for them. Elisa and Ellen's stories both carry a strong social criticism about the position of women, each in their respective historical context. Because of this, it is clear that The Coquette by Hannah Webster Foster offers a clear influence over The Age of Innocence, and it can be mostly seen in the depiction of Elisa Wharton and Helen Olenska.
And tell me, have you enjoyed doing such research?
Yes, I have enjoyed reading both novels as well as doing the research. I find really interesting the fact that two women had the opportunity to make such statements against the social pressure that women suffered in both 18th and 19th centuries. Both novels can be seen as important steps for feminist literature and social criticism because they vindicate the role of women at that time.
I see. Well, that is such an interesting and wonderful research. I'm really happy of having been able to listen to you, so thank you so much for sharing your work with us.
Thanks to you for inviting me to the podcast.
It has been a pleasure.